No, thank you, Abhijit. I'm very glad to be here and given this chance to talk to our fellow architects. I can't resist but to go back to my own college days. I went to college in JJ in Bombay, JJ School of Architecture, now JJ College of Architecture, located right in the center of the city where all the action was. And we lived in hostels which were 12 kilometers or 15 or longer, maybe 15, 20 kilometers distance, and traveled by local trains. And I think this way we had to acclimatize with the city was like any ordinary human being would. Travel by train in packed like sardines, go to college, attend classes, some of which were very, very educative and very, very attractive, others not so interesting, and some of which we are very cynical about also. But more importantly, being in the heart of the city, we kind of walked and we saw the city, we were on the street. And that was the period in which we could walk into architects' offices and just go and chat. Most of our professors were teaching us, were practicing us also. And some very well-known names, from Charles Correa down to, Architects Combined, a legendary firm, a little less known, highly interested in education. All the partners taught in schools and colleges, JJ and Academy and Bandra School. But what happened was that we started engaging with the city in a very natural way. And this engaging with the city is an aspect which I want to emphasize on, that you cannot be studying architecture in a place and not engage with the place. In today's education, the place has got completely detached from education. I think it's very significant to engage with the place. And when I reflect on my past as a student, I was one of the many student leaders. We had 5 strikes in 5 years to improve the curriculum. It became a joke in Bombay University. They said it's the JJ annual strike. That happens usually before exams so that we can postpone the exams. But the result of which were the entire curriculum and the faculty and the whole course and everything changed subsequently for next generation of architecture students. We also had a chance to interact with, that time New Bombay was coming up as a city, and out of one's own interest, one went and spent time looking at New Bombay, interacting with the architects who were engaged in making of New Bombay under the leadership of Charles Correa. We also interacted with, I personally, for example, went and attended classes at the Industrial Design Center, IIT Powai, entirely at my own initiative because it was very interesting. It was also designed for the first time. You had a product design, Industrial Design Center, after NID, the second one, but the first one in Bombay. So that we went there. Then again, out of one's own interest, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, which has a tradition of engaging with the city of Bombay and working with the communities, was also very attractive, and we went and some of us attended classes there. So in fact, I had a difficult time maintaining my minimum balance of attendance to be able to sit for exams, and just about managed. But I think when we met, many of us met after many years, we came to the common conclusion that our learning was as much due to the school as in spite of it. And that's a very important point I want to make, that education is as much due to the schools as in spite of it. And it is as much from the teachers as the lateral learning from your fellow students. And all this could happen because we had students, we had a very cosmopolitan class. About 12 students were foreign students, mostly of Indian origin, some Malaysians, some Thai, but from South Africa, East Africa, Nepal, Bhutan, and all kinds of places. So they brought the political and the social dynamics of these places, which for us was spectacular because they were much more aware and much more engaged. South Africa was still under apartheid. So anybody who came from South Africa was highly political and highly socially minded. And so, but that period is history. That was the time when the world has two big ideologies. You had capitalism and you had Marxism. And the debate was between capitalism and Marxism. Now the two big ideas have now developed their own crisis. They have not exactly collapsed, but they have mutated into many kind of ideologies. And in architecture, it's also important to understand that architecture has mutated itself. From one modern movement, three big names we used to study, Corbusier, Mies, and Wright. And well, a secondary level, Richard Neutra and some other, Philip Johnson, etc., Paul Rudolph, they came later on, but pretty much falling in the same kind of school of thought. The big idea of a modern architecture as a monolith has collapsed, and it has mutated itself. And why does it mutate itself? It mutates itself because of the development process. You cannot detach architecture from the development process of a country. The development process demanded, I mean, we know more than 95% of the world's population don't go to architects. They do it on their own. So there's a book by Bernard Rudofsky called Architecture Without Architects. And sometimes I wonder whether it is now time to write a book, if I have to be a little cynical, as Architects Without Architecture. So I think the architecture has mutated itself. The mutation has come in the face of crisis, economic crisis, in the face of aspirations and needs of the people, in the face of communities feeling excluded, and in the face of people wanting to be different. That's all. People are influenced, and then came globalization. And with globalization, of course, information opened up. People began to saw the world. I mean, for example, today, I remember coming back from Dehradun, Mussoorie, by road at 9 o'clock at night in a village which barely had few electrical poles and stolen electricity. A bunch of people sitting there on the village square. We stopped for tea and we wanted to see what's going on. We thought this was a big meeting, but the television set there. And they were sitting and watching Bold and the Beautiful. And the Pradhan was sitting there explaining to everybody what is going on. And what was going on for the village would be scandalous. But there were these women in Wales sitting there and intently listening to that whole thing that was going on. All the affairs and all the, escapades and all the legitimate and illegitimate events that were portrayed in the soap opera. So what I'm trying to say with opening up of the information and opening up the world and the advent of new technologies and information technology, which Chetan pointed out, world opened up a lot more. And it had its positive side. The positive side is people began to know what's happening elsewhere. And the levels of aspiration also went up. It also brought in consumerism of an unprecedented scale. It also began to detach people from their immediate contexts. I mean, out of the large number of people who have walked through our practice last 20 years in Delhi or so, a majority of them are today in the United States. Some of them have come back. Most of them are working for corporate entities. And the days of the small practice is getting numbered. Now, this is the context. I don't want to go too much into the context anymore. But in this context, what I want to point out is that there is, we have to understand that when it comes to education and running of schools, do we kind of keep running with the events and get overtaken by the events? Do we keep running in all kinds of directions without any kind of coherent thinking that holds the school together? Or do we sit back and sort of redefine our roles more systematically and in a more relevant way? First thing I want to point out is making education and making money are two different things. Don't forever, please, equate the two as the same. So educational goals set up entirely to support making money is hardly a goal. I mean, we're talking about academics, schools. We are in a profession which has produced the least amount of research. We are in a profession whose theoretical contribution is very little to be expected. We are in a profession where new ideas haven't even consolidated, and there's been no attempt to even consolidate and debate it. So the profession, education is as much about academics, debate, building up of knowledge, building up of theory, as for practicing or working. So please, let's get out of our mind this fact that architecture equals service sector. We are a service sector, but at the same time we are not a service sector. We are a bit of a service sector. We are also a faculty. We are a program. We are a profession. So please keep this to aside. And what is worrying is, in the current events, you can imagine, I mean, I was heading Susant School of Art and Architecture for 3 years in between, and really enjoyed doing that job. When I had opened up the school for 24 hours, I was told by my promoters that that's not possible. The boys and girls being left alone in the studio at night. I said, I take the responsibility. And nothing untoward ever happened. Students enjoyed it, and that was probably a great period for the school. But going back to promoters, what happens is, today we find promoters, a lot of them come from the real estate world, and now that the real estate is in crisis, they find education more profitable. Education is not for profit. I mean, yes, I mean, anybody who sets up an enterprise is bound to make profit, but there's got to be some semblance of, some proportion in the kind of profit motive and what you offer to the society. The objective under which you come and your stated objectives is to contribute to education development of society, so it is in a way a corporate social responsibility. But most of them charge a lot of fee, but don't necessarily plow back the income into education. The plight of teachers, pathetic. I mean, why should, I think every school needs a group of solid, robust, core group of teachers. At least half a dozen core group of robust teachers who are very well looked after. So the working conditions, it's not just the salary, of having access to research budgets, self-development, career development, etc. And that should be part of the condition that the Council of Architecture should really insist on, instead of fiddling with who's got a degree with 55%, who's got a degree with 61%. I worked with a legendary person called Professor John Turner, who you may know, wrote the book called Housing by People and changed the whole thinking of housing in the course of the world, whose book was translated into 17 languages. And I was lucky that I was handpicked by him to work with him as an associate at Development Planning Unit London. And to this man, Professor Turner, who won the Alternative Nobel Prize and known is a household name across the world, did not have a master's degree. And he taught at MIT, then he moved and set up the program at Development Planning Unit at Bartlett School in London. And he said, I'll remain an associate or a senior fellow or a lecturer. He was paid a professor's salary, it was equivalence, he was called a professor, but he opted for that because he was developing a philosophical line of thinking in architecture. He was not interested in administering education that much. He collaborated with others who were interested in administering education, designing curriculum, and to draw from his work and academic content. By the way, Professor John Turner's work went on to contribute to the entire policy making of the World Bank of sites and services and slum upgrading projects, which is a global phenomenon across the world. So, point I'm trying to make here is that you need a school that has a core group of robust teachers who love teaching, whose passion is teaching, and who will be well looked after. And my appeal to IIA is to really interact with the council and look at who's a promoter. In this country, anybody can become a developer. A property broker becomes a developer, and a developer becomes a promoter of an educational institution. And so the intellect and the knowledge that's required to set up good schools is totally missing in the process. Another point I want to make is that every school needs mentors. A mentor. I mean, some schools in India have started with this thing like opening up an academic chair. I know one of our fellow professionals, Narendra Dengle, has an academic chair in Goa College of Architecture. Plays a very general role in giving direction to the school. Spends about a week every month in the school, full time, interacts with students, treats students as participants and not as just recipients in a classroom, interacts with the faculty, brings his own experiences and knowledge, and helps the school sort of establish a direction and continuous evaluation of your own work. So since under the tree in the school or after the school hours to have a cup of chai were highly inspiring for students, and that set the kind of tone for SEPT's architectural thinking. And it influenced the school so much that I think it influenced the school a bit, probably a bit too much, but I think it's very important to have mentors. Schools should have mentors. So now coming to schools in small locations, outer, like small towns and not in metropolitan cities and so on, the interesting thing which I notice now is that when it comes to practice in big cities has become more difficult because practice has got corporatized and the small boutique practices are suffering. That would include practices at mine, and I presume like Neeraj Manchanda's, or there may be many others in this room who sort of find it difficult to actually stay as a boutique practice. Either you grow big, survive, or you perish. That's the kind of logic that's coming in. But that's a general phenomenon which you have to accept. But in practice in small towns are doing very well. Some people who had worked with me in the past in practicing in smaller towns are doing extremely well. Extremely well, not just financially, monetarily, but the kind of projects, the medium-sized and small projects that make sense, that are real, that are rooted in the lives of the people and their livelihoods and their day-to-day needs, and not this fake green field sites in the middle of paddy fields in outlying Haryana or UP. They're doing extremely well. So why shouldn't schools do well? Sometimes I wonder. I think the big schools also have to mentor small schools. Like SPA, I'm extremely glad that for the first time we have Parliament deciding to convert SPA into a center of excellence, puts it at par with IIT, IIMs, and Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, which are top-grade academic institutions. So with that, with the faculty of SPA who are here, I think with that comes a tremendous responsibility of SPA to look at education and to help education in general also. Now everybody is talking about collaborating with foreign universities. Especially if you go to a private university, they'll always say, let's bring a foreign university and collaborate. It doesn't matter what you collaborate on. The idea is to just collaborate because you've got a brand name and a tag that I'm tied to Manchester or to Boston or some far-off locale and some big name. Why can't there be collaboration between schools in India? The older and the more established schools helping mentor the smaller schools. That's another point I want to bring in. The next is coming to regulations and promotion. We talked about promoters of schools. In terms of regulators, I'm not personally, with due apologies, due respect to Council of Architecture, I'm not so sure if Council is the right body to regulate education, whose governing body is dominated by chief architects of governments, of state governments, whose mandate is to register architects, license architects for practice. And they have, being a statutory body, obviously, they have a right to appropriate the domain of education also. But I think, after all, the council consists of only architects, so I can only appeal to them as architects. And when I appeal to them as architects, I would say that, one horrible syndrome in India has been, if I'm the president of an organization, and suppose an invitation comes that we want somebody to come and discuss alternative energy or alternative technologies in India, on which I have done very little or no work, I nominate myself and I go because I'm the president. I don't look around and see. I have a huge responsibility upon myself to pick up the right person for the right job. So deployment of people, we don't do that. We just appropriate for ourselves. We have been given the responsibility as, let's say, being the head or of the organization or a management committee member or whatever, to play a constructive role, to putting the people at the right place for the right purpose, so that we can influence society and have a more respectable position in our society. Unfortunately, that generosity is generally missing among architects, and I'm not keeping myself aside, for heaven's sake, but it's a big phenomenon, time to ponder about and think about. And I think in the mutation we are talking about, how many mutants are there today? You just go on. City and urbanism, urban design, alternative technologies, alternative materials, community architecture, barefoot architecture. It just goes on and on. The list goes on and on. We have people, architects have diverse. From Susan schools, I find some of my ex-students who are now practicing. Many of them are doing graphic signage, exhibition design, some are doing product design, some have gone into, all kinds of directions. So it is so diverse. But the point is, idea is that one should not see this mutation as cancer cells mutating and further mutating and further mutating and sort of live off the past glory about the architecture being a monolithic profession, but rather celebrate this mutation and begin to understand what does this mutation constitute. For example, green buildings. You have LEED certification, you have GREHA certification, and you have buildings without certification. With pride I can say, I don't want to name particular architects, there are architects in Delhi, for example, who have done buildings whose buildings have not been certified or rated. And if you really sit down to rate the buildings, they're more green than some of the so-called green buildings with LEED certification. I mean, I see a photograph of a building with mirror glass on the west side on the facade, rated as a green building, because of the rating of the glass is one of the factors that has contributed to classifying it as a green building. Now, these are, so it's very easy to just borrow and import these ideas and wear these hats and these tags on your chest. But I think it's a very serious issue, and that's why, for example, a large space has been appropriated by these rating organizations away from architecture, and they have trading on the domain where ideally, typically, we should be trading and defining and what is green. You come to my house. I mean, my house became green 10 years after I lived in that house and suddenly felt the necessity to lower the energy cost because it was pinching me. And so I went to a series of retrofit and landscape interventions which to green the building. And I find that has been, it doesn't fit into the standard conventional thinking of the LEED rating or GREHA rating. It's never been rated. But there are architects like, for Vasant Kamath, for example, some of his works you can see. Okay, last point I want to mention is that point Chetan mentioned about design studio, architecture studio. Now, studio is a temple of architecture. And I think the life should revolve around studio. And in organizing studios, I feel, don't isolate by having architects only as teachers. The studio should have a composite of architects, landscape architects, and structural designers, insofar as they are designers, to come together and work together. After so many years of teaching, many schools of architecture don't even have a subject called site planning. How do you do farming without knowing the ground, without knowing the condition of the soil? So you cannot do buildings without knowing the platform. So landscape is very important. Technology, structural design, so they should be highly integrated and everything should be taught on the studio base. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Das, for your highly illustrative journey of the profession.